The Kaethari called it the slow war because that was the only kind of war humanity ever seemed to fight. No grand fleets, no opening barrage that lit up a sky, just years, decades, and a species that refused to stop showing up. Ambassador Chen Wei had been told before boarding the Kaethari flagship Resonant Tide that she was walking into a courtroom disguised as a negotiation. The Kaethari High Assembly did not summon delegations to discuss peace. They summoned delegations to formalize the terms of a surrender they considered inevitable. 3 of humanity's outer colonies had already gone dark under Kaethari blockade. A fourth was 6 weeks from starvation. And still, Earth had sent one woman alone aboard an unarmed shuttle to sit at a table built for giants. The war itself had no clean beginning, the way most wars claim to. There had been no declaration, no ultimatum delivered in the grand style of old human history books. There had simply been a survey ship, humanity's third attempt at faster-than-light contact with a neighboring system, drifting into space the Kaethari considered theirs by right of 11,000 years of unchallenged presence. The survey crew had been given 11 seconds to alter course. They had not understood the warning in time. Of the 14 souls aboard, 6 survived, and the 6 who survived spent the rest of their lives being asked over and over by senators and historians and their own grandchildren whether they had known in that moment that they were about to start something that would outlive them. They had not known. No one had. That was the strange, quiet truth Chen Wei carried with her onto every Kaethari vessel she had ever boarded. Wars this large were rarely started on purpose. They were simply allowed to continue, by people on both sides who kept believing year after year that the next engagement would be the one that finally ended it. She was 51 years old. She had gray in her hair and a permanent ache in her left knee from a colony drop landing 30 years earlier that had never quite healed right. She did not look like someone who could stop a war. That, she had come to understand, was precisely the point. The Kaethari were not cruel in the way old human stories imagined alien conquerors to be. They were patient, methodical, and utterly convinced of their own superiority, not out of malice but out of arithmetic. Their civilization was 11,000 years old. They had mapped the collapse and rebirth of 100 species before humanity had learned to smelt bronze. To the Kaethari, war was not passion. War was accounting. You calculated the industrial capacity of your enemy, the range of their ships, the psychology of their leadership, and you arrived at a number. That number told you how the war would end, and usually how long it would take. Their number for humanity had said 4 years. It had been 11. High Speaker Vihore Ask met her in a chamber with a ceiling so high it seemed to swallow the light. The Kaethari were tall, nearly 8 feet at the shoulder crest, built like something between a heron and a wolf, with feathered ridges along their arms that shifted color with mood the way human faces shifted with expression. Vihore's ridges were the deep blue-gray of contained impatience. Ambassador, Vihore said in flawless Mandarin, because the Kaethari always spoke to humans in whichever human language would make the human most uncomfortable to hear from an alien throat. You have arrived to discuss the terms of your species' withdrawal from contested space. I would ask that we not waste each other's remaining years. Chen Wei set her satchel down on the table between them. It was an old leather thing cracked at the corners, the kind of object that had clearly traveled with her for a long time and had no intention of being replaced. I didn't come to discuss withdrawal, she said. I came to discuss the blockade of Meridian Station. The blockade of Meridian Station is not a subject for negotiation. It is a demonstration. Of what? Of the futility of your position. Vihore's ridges pulsed a shade darker. Ambassador, I have reviewed your species' entire military history in preparation for this meeting. Do you know what I found remarkable? Not your technology. Your technology is, forgive me, adequate. What I found remarkable is that you have never once in 11 years achieved a decisive victory. Not one battle that ended a campaign, not one strategy that broke our formations cleanly. You have fought us to a draw for over a decade using nothing but persistence, and you call this a war effort worth continuing. Chen Wei almost smiled. Almost. You say that like it's an insult, she said. It is an observation. It's the whole answer, speaker. She opened the satchel and withdrew a small data slate worn soft at the edges from handling. She did not activate it yet. She simply held it, turning it over once in her hands, the way a person turns over a familiar stone. May I tell you about my grandmother, she said. Before we talk about Meridian Station. Vihore's ridges flickered with something that might in a Kaethari have been the beginning of irritation or the beginning of curiosity. The two often looked the same on them. This is relevant to a blockade. Everything is relevant to a blockade if you're patient enough to see it. She sat down across from him without waiting for permission, which she had been warned was itself a small act of defiance the Kaethari would notice and catalog. My grandmother survived a famine as a child. Not a war, a famine. 3 years of failed harvests in a province that no one outside it remembers the name of anymore. She used to tell me that the people who died first weren't the weak ones. They were the ones who spent everything they had on the first bad year, hoping it would be the only one. The ones who survived were the ones who learned to live on less than they needed, for longer than seemed possible because they understood something the others didn't. What was that? That endurance isn't a strategy for winning quickly. It's a strategy for not losing indefinitely. And an enemy who cannot lose eventually stops being an enemy worth the cost of fighting. Vihora made a low sound in his throat, a Kaethari expression of dismissal she had learned to recognize from prior briefings. Sentiment is not strategy, Ambassador, she agreed. But it produced one. Would you like to see it? She activated the slate. What appeared above the table was not a battle plan. It was a supply chain, three-dimensional sprawling built from thousands of small nodes connected by threads of light, farms, fabrication plants, water reclamation facilities. Orbital shipyards no larger than a warehouse tucked into asteroid clusters the Kaethari sensors had dismissed as debris fields not worth cataloging. This is Meridian Station's actual production network, Chen Wei said. Not the one your intelligence reports describe, the one that exists. Your blockade has cut off 11 official supply routes. We have 43 unofficial ones built over the last 6 years specifically because we assumed eventually someone like you would try exactly what you are doing now. Vihora leaned forward. For the first time since she had entered the chamber, his ridges stilled completely, the Kaethari equivalent she knew of a held breath. This is a fabrication, he said. A theatrical prop to encourage a bluff. Speaker, I would very much like to be bluffing. It would mean I got to go home sooner. She let that sit a moment. I'm not. Meridian Station has 8 months of independent reserves at current consumption, and that number climbs every month your blockade holds because it forces us to keep building. You didn't starve a colony. You accidentally funded an infrastructure project. Your ships are slower than yours, weaker than yours, fewer than yours. All true all the time for 11 years. And in 11 years, Speaker, how many systems have you taken from us? Silence. None, she said. Not because we're stronger, because every time you calculate the cost of taking one, the number that comes back isn't about our fleet. It's about how long we're willing to keep replacing what you destroy. And we have never not once told you that number because we don't know it ourselves. There isn't a ceiling. That's what a species that has survived famines and floods, and its own worst instincts for 200,000 years actually learns, eventually. That the will to continue is not a resource that runs out on any timeline your accountants can model. Vihora was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its practiced formality. Analysts predicted your collapse 3 separate times. Each time the models were revised, and each time they were wrong again in the same direction. Because your models measure capacity, Chen Wei said. They don't measure the thing that decides whether a species uses what capacity it has left. We're not a fast people, Speaker. We're not even by your standards a particularly clever one. You've beaten us in nearly every engagement where cleverness alone decided the outcome. But we are an unreasonably stubborn one, and stubbornness scales in ways your species never had to learn, because you never had to survive anything that didn't eventually end. You believe your endurance will outlast our patience. I believe your patience was always a calculation, and calculations update when the input changes. She gestured at the glowing network still hanging in the air between them. The input just changed. Vihora stood, moving to the great curved window behind him where the stars hung motionless and indifferent, the way they always did regardless of what species happened to be arguing beneath them. For a long while he said nothing at all. There is a word in Old Kaethari, he said finally, that we do not use anymore, THRESKAL. It described an opponent whose defeat was not worth its cost, not because they could win, but because the act of continuing to try to defeat them would consume more of you than it would ever take from them. We stopped using the word 11,000 years ago when we stopped believing we would ever meet such an opponent again. He turned back to face her. I will not tell you the blockade ends today. That decision is not mine alone to make, and I suspect you already knew that when you walked in. His ridges had shifted to a color she hadn't seen before, something paler, more uncertain. But I will tell my assembly that the arithmetic they were given was wrong, and I will tell them why. Chen Wei closed the slate and returned it to her satchel, the worn leather creaking softly in the vast silence of the chamber. That's all I came here to do, she said. I didn't come to win a war today, Speaker. My grandmother would have told you that's not how it's done. You just come back, again and again for as long as it takes until the people across the table run out of reasons to keep counting. She rose to leave. At the door, Vihora's voice stopped her. Ambassador, 11 years. Was there ever a point where your species considered simply stopping? Chen Wei thought of Meridian Station. Of the 43 quiet supply lines threaded through empty rock that no scanner had thought worth a second glance. Of every engineer and farmer and shipwright who had spent 6 years building something they hoped would never be needed and had built it anyway. She thought of her grandmother's stories, told over rationed tea in a kitchen 1,000 light years and 2 centuries away from this room. No, she said. That's rather the point. She had not told him the rest of it because it was not the kind of thing that translated cleanly into a language built for calculation. She had not told him about the 6-year-old boy on Meridian Station who had drawn a picture of the blockade ships for a school assignment and titled it, in careful crayon letters, "The Patient Ones," because his teacher had told the class that the enemy above them was not evil, only very old and very slow to change its mind, and that the children's job was simply to keep growing up anyway. She had not told him about the shipwrights who worked 18-hour shifts in asteroid hollows with no windows, who had never seen a Kaethari vessel with their own eyes and never expected to, and who nonetheless carved small tally marks into the walls of their fabrication bays for every month the line held. She had not told him because none of it would have mattered to the assembly's arithmetic, and because in the end none of it needed to. The proof was not in the stories. Proof was in the 8 months of reserves, and the 43 supply lines, and the simple, stubborn fact of a species that was still there to have the conversation at all. The doors closed behind her, and the resonant tide continued on its long, slow orbit, carrying inside it an old and patient civilization that had just, for the first time in 11,000 years, discovered a species more patient than itself. The blockade of Meridian Station lifted 4 months later. It was not announced as a defeat. The Kaethari Assembly never called it that in any record humanity was ever shown. They called it a reallocation of resources toward more productive engagements. The blockade ship simply altered course one gray morning, and the station's long-range sensors, manned by people who had spent 6 years assuming this day might never come, watched them go without quite believing it. On Meridian Station, the boy who had drawn the patient ones was 12 years old by then, and he stood on an observation deck with his mother and watched the last Kaethari hull shrink to a point of light and vanish. He did not cheer. The way the news broadcasts back on Earth would later show people cheering in the wide plazas of cities that had never once gone hungry during the blockade. He simply asked his mother whether the ships were coming back, and his mother, who had spent 6 years learning to answer difficult questions carefully, told him the truth, that she did not know that no one knew that the only thing anyone could promise him was that Meridian Station would still be there to find out, however long it took. Chen Wei read the full report at her kitchen table 3 weeks after that, the same kind of worn wooden table her grandmother had once told stories across in a kitchen 100 light years and 2 centuries removed from this one. The report was long, dense with the particular bloodless language diplomats used to describe the end of a siege, and she read every page of it before she allowed herself to set it down and simply sit, for a while in the quiet. She thought about Vihore Ask, and the strange pale color his ridges had taken on when he'd finally understood what her satchel contained. She wondered whether he had told his assembly the whole of it, the word THRESKAL unused for 11,000 years, spoken aloud again in a chamber built for beings who had never expected to need it. She suspected he had not. Some truths, even among a species built on cold arithmetic, were easier to act on quietly than to say aloud in front of an audience. It did not matter in the end whether they said the word. What mattered was that the ships had turned, and Meridian Station's lights had stayed on, and somewhere in a fabrication bay with no windows, a shipwright who had never seen a Kaethari vessel with her own eyes, carved one final tally mark into a wall that would likely stand unremarked for the rest of human history, a small private record of a war that had never been won by force, only endured until the other side found it was no longer worth the arithmetic. Some wars were not won in a single battle, or a single treaty, or a single brilliant maneuver that broke the enemy's line. Some wars were won the way a stone is worn smooth by a river that never once raised its voice, quietly, patiently, for exactly as long as it took, by a species that had never learned any other way to survive, and had never needed to. Humanity had not won the slow war by being faster or stronger or clever than the civilization arrayed against it. It had won, if that word even applied, by being the kind of species that simply refused to stop showing up at the negotiating table, in the fabrication bays, on the observation decks of stations that should have starved and didn't, for exactly as long as it took the other side to do the math and realize that some opponents were never meant to be defeated, only outlasted. And so 11,000 years after the Kaethari had last needed the word, and 11 years after a survey ship drifted into space it did not understand, the High Assembly filed its final report on the conflict under a designation that would remain, for the rest of recorded Kaethari history, a quiet and permanent footnote in a civilization that had thought it already knew every kind of enemy the galaxy could offer. THRESKAL. Confirmed.